December 20th, 1943. Skies above Bremen, Germany. The headphones crackled with static as Technical Sergeant Warren Miller settled deeper into his ball turret position. A thin film of frost crept across the plexiglass dome as the B-17 Flying Fortress droned at 27,000 feet through solid overcast. Words from that morning's briefing echoed in his mind. Zero visibility predicted over target area. Fighter opposition expected to be heavy. His gloved fingers traced small circles on the twin .50 caliber machine gun's triggers. 8 months earlier, instructors at gunnery school would have court-martialed anyone who suggested firing without visual confirmation of the target. "You don't shoot what you can't see," had been hammered into every gunner since the Army Air Forces began operations in the European theatre. Yet here he was, preparing to do exactly that. The formation had been flying in solid overcast for 47 minutes. Radio chatter indicated German fighters were assembling below. Through breaks in the clouds, bomber crews glimpsed dark shapes rising toward them. Then Miller's headset crackled with the command that would transform aerial combat doctrine. "All gunners, commence firing on Patton Baker 6. Fire blind. Repeat, fire blind." Hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously across the bomber formation. 8,000 rounds per minute sliced through the cloud layer beneath them, creating a lethal curtain of steel that extended 200 yards below and 300 yards behind the formation. The mathematics of probability were replacing the art of visual marksmanship. The results defied conventional wisdom. When the formation broke through the overcast 20 miles later, the sky beneath them was littered with smoking German fighters. Intelligence officers later documented 24 enemy aircraft destroyed during the Bremen raid with only 6 B-17s lost, a dramatic reversal of the catastrophic loss ratios experienced earlier that year. Miller's post-mission report, preserved in 8th Air Force archives, described the revelation. "We couldn't see a damn thing, but we knew exactly where they'd be. The math worked. I fired 382 rounds on prescribed pattern without visual contact and claimed 2 probables. Later, another crew confirmed 1 FW-190 destroyed. I never saw the aircraft I shot down." What Miller and other gunners had stumbled upon was a revolutionary concept in aerial defense, volumetric firing or pattern defense, that contradicted every principle of aerial gunnery developed since machine guns first took to the skies in World War I. Instead of tracking individual targets and attempting precise fire, bomber crews were calculating the most likely avenues of attack and saturating them with defensive fire before enemy fighters even appeared. The transformation had begun 9 months earlier, on March 4, 1943, when the 8th Air Force suffered devastating losses during the first daylight raid on Berlin. 21 bombers were shot down out of 67 dispatched, a catastrophic 31% loss rate that threatened to make the entire strategic bombing campaign unsustainable. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis Wilkins, a mathematics professor from MIT before the war, had watched the gun camera footage from surviving aircraft with growing frustration. "Our gunners are trying to hit supersonic targets with technology designed for visual tracking," he noted in a memo to General Ira Eaker. "The problem isn't their marksmanship, it's the entire approach." Wilkins began developing what would become known as defensive box theory, a mathematical model predicting that German fighters would approach bomber formations along specific vectors determined by closure rates, sun position, and formation geometry. By firing along these predicted approaches, gunners could create lethal zones of fire without needing to see their targets. The concept seemed insane to traditional gunnery officers. Major Thomas Reynolds, chief of gunnery training at Harlingen Field, dismissed the approach as wasteful spray and pray nonsense that violates every principle of aerial marksmanship. Yet the devastating losses continued, and desperation bred willingness to try unorthodox solutions. By December 1943, volumetric firing patterns had been refined into standardized defensive protocols. The results would transform aerial warfare in ways no one could have predicted when gunners first opened fire into empty clouds and filled the sky with German wrecks. The engineering specifications of the B-17 defensive armament system revealed both the challenge and the opportunity that Wilkins had identified. Each flying fortress carried 13 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns with a combined rate of fire of 10,400 rounds per minute. With 6,380 rounds of ammunition distributed among the positions, a full bomber could theoretically maintain continuous fire for approximately 36 seconds before exhaustion. In practice, conventional gunnery doctrine dictated short, controlled bursts at visually acquired targets. Gunners typically expended between 90 and 150 rounds per engagement, resulting in an average hit ratio of 2%. Analysis of gun camera footage from February through April 1943 confirmed this dismal statistic. For every 1,000 rounds fired under visual tracking protocols, only 20 rounds struck enemy aircraft. Even more troubling, only 1 in every 5 strikes caused significant damage. Major General Curtis LeMay, reviewing these statistics in May 1943, calculated that under conventional doctrine, a B-17 would need to carry 31,500 rounds to mathematically ensure the destruction of a single enemy fighter. The weight constraints of the aircraft made this impossible. The true vulnerability lay in the engagement geometry. German fighter pilots had refined their tactics to approach bomber formations from specific angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire. Frontal attacks at the bomber's 12 o'clock high position and beam attacks from 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock level became preferred approach vectors. These attacks came at closure rates between 400 and 550 miles per hour, giving gunners less than 2 seconds to acquire, track, lead, and fire effectively. The fundamental flaw, Wilkins noted in his April 29, 1943 report to 8th Air Force Headquarters, is that we are asking gunners to solve complex three-dimensional trigonometry problems while under fire. The human eye and brain cannot compute the necessary lead angles at these closure rates. Lieutenant Robert Weatherby of the 91st Bomb Group became an unexpected pioneer of pattern firing during a mission to Hamburg on May 14, 1943. When his upper turret jammed in the elevated position, he discovered he could still fire along a fixed azimuth as German fighters passed through his cone of fire. "I couldn't track them," he reported after landing, "so I just put the guns where I calculated they would be and fired continuously." Gun camera footage confirmed Weatherby had destroyed 2 FW-190s without ever visually tracking them. His experience prompted Colonel Burton Hazlitt, Director of Combat Operations for the 8th Bomber Command, to authorize limited experimentation with what was tentatively called predicted field fire. Training protocols were hastily developed at Bovingdon Airfield in England, where a specialized range used moving silhouettes on wires to simulate fighter approaches. Gunners were blindfolded and instructed to fire at specific timing intervals as mechanical systems moved targets through predicted intercept points. Initial results were poor, with hit rates below 1%. Veteran gunners resisted the approach, insisting that you don't shoot what you can't see. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Lieutenant James Chadwick, a mechanical engineer before the war, developed a modified computing site that calculated probable intercept points based on formation position, speed, and altitude. When coupled with standardized firing patterns, hit probabilities increased dramatically. By July 1943, 8 bomber groups were experimenting with pattern defense protocols on specific portions of their routes. Data collected from these missions showed that while ammunition expenditure increased by 340%, confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed increased by 620%. Even more significant, German fighter pilots began reporting unusual difficulties when attacking formations employing pattern defense. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 1 noted in his combat diary, "Something has changed. We came under intense fire before visual acquisition range. Several aircraft were hit while still maneuvering for attack position. The transformation accelerated through August and September 1943 as Wilkins refined the mathematical models and developed 15 standardized firing patterns designated by alphanumeric codes. Pattern Baker 6, which would prove most effective against frontal attacks, created a three-dimensional curtain of fire extending 250 yards ahead of the formation through which attacking fighters must pass. The ballistic principles behind blind firing transformed aerial gunnery from an art of precision into a science of probability. At its core lay a simple yet revolutionary concept. Instead of hitting a specific target, gunners would create a three-dimensional volume of fire through which enemy aircraft must pass. The mathematics resembled artillery barrage calculations more than traditional marksmanship. Lieutenant Colonel Wilkins and his team developed firing solutions based on statistical analysis of German attack patterns. Their work revealed that Luftwaffe pilots, despite individual variations in technique, followed predictable approach vectors determined by fundamental physical constraints. Fighter aircraft attacking bombers at 25,000 feet had limited energy management options, requiring them to maintain specific airspeed ranges to execute effective attacks while preserving enough energy to escape. This created calculable probability cones, three-dimensional spaces where German fighters would most likely appear. By saturating these zones with defensive fire, gunners could achieve hit probabilities far exceeding those of visual tracking techniques. The B-17's 1350 caliber machine guns could project 172 rounds per second through these calculated zones, creating lethal barriers that German pilots nicknamed steel curtains. Technical modifications to gunnery systems soon followed. The Sperry K4 computing gun sight received additional calibration markers for pattern overlay, standardized firing positions that matched the mathematical models. Turret rotation limiters were installed on some aircraft to prevent gunners from tracking outside their assigned sectors, ensuring disciplined adherence to the defensive pattern. Ammunition loads were reconfigured to support the new doctrine. The standard combat load of 6,380 rounds was reorganized with 65% allocated to pattern defense protocols and 35% reserved for visual tracking against determined attackers who penetrated the initial barrage. New tracer rounds with extended visibility were developed, comprising every fifth round in pattern defense belts to enhance the psychological impact on German pilots. Training programs underwent complete restructuring. The Advanced Aerial Gunnery School at Harlingen Field, Texas developed specialized simulators where gunners practiced firing at timing intervals rather than visible targets. They learned to respond to coded commands. Pattern Alpha for high frontal attacks, Pattern Charlie for beam attacks, Pattern Echo for attacks from below. Resistance from veteran gunners was fierce. Staff Sergeant William Dawson, with 15 combat missions completed by August 1943, expressed the sentiment of many experienced crew members. "This is absolute madness. They're asking us to waste ammunition firing at empty sky while real targets fly past." The psychological barriers proved as challenging as the technical ones. Gunnery was deeply rooted in visual confirmation. Firing without seeing the enemy felt wrong to men trained in traditional marksmanship. Some gunners secretly reverted to visual tracking during early implementation, undermining the effectiveness of the system. Colonel Mark Ledbetter, commander of the 305th Bombardment Group, took radical action to overcome this resistance. On September 8, 1943, he ordered the removal of optical sights from turrets during a mission to Stuttgart, forcing gunners to rely entirely on pattern protocols. The results were startling. 7 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed without a single bomber lost. Technical Sergeant Ray Wilkerson, a ball turret gunner on that mission, later recalled, "I thought the colonel had lost his mind. Then I saw a Focke-Wulf tumble past my position trailing smoke. I never saw him coming, never tracked him, just fired my pattern as ordered. That's when I became a believer. Implementation accelerated through October 1943 as the mathematics was refined and gunners gained confidence in the system. The 91st, 305th and 381st Bombardment Groups became the primary test units, flying missions with increasingly standardized pattern defense protocols. Ammunition expenditure increased by 280%, but bomber losses decreased by 38%. By November 1943, all heavy bomber groups in the 8th Air Force had received basic training in volumetric firing techniques. The first full-scale implementation occurred during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on November 3rd, resulting in 76 confirmed Luftwaffe fighters destroyed, the highest single-day total to that point in the campaign. The technique that defied conventional wisdom had proven its worth. Gunners opening fire blind were filling the sky with German wrecks, fundamentally altering the mathematics of strategic bombing. January 15, 1944. Skies above Ossersleben, Germany. The weather briefing had predicted clear skies, but as the 388th Bomb Group's 24 B-17s approached the target, a thick cloud layer materialized at 22,000 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Preston, commanding the lead squadron, faced a critical decision. Traditional doctrine would have demanded visual confirmation before engaging enemy fighters. Instead, he keyed his microphone and issued the order that would validate months of experimental training. All aircraft, implement pattern Dog 4. 3-second bursts, 5-second intervals. Execute now. 136 50 caliber machine guns across the formation began firing in synchronized waves. Every fifth round was a tracer, creating a mesmerizing lattice of light that sliced through the cloud layer below. The mathematics of probability had replaced the art of marksmanship. Within 7 minutes, the formation penetrated the cloud layer and discovered the results below. Technical Sergeant David Holloway, waist gunner on Carolina Moon, recorded the scene in his combat diary. We broke through at 18,000 feet and couldn't believe our eyes. At least 8 German fighters were spiraling downward, trailing smoke. 3 were completely engulfed in flames. None of us had seen them coming, yet we'd torn them apart. The pattern worked exactly as Colonel Wilkins predicted. German records later confirmed the 308th had destroyed 11 fighters and damaged 7 more without a single bomber lost. Among the destroyed aircraft was that of Hauptmann Ernst Schroeder, commanding officer of the Cerberus JG-1, who had achieved 67 victories before encountering the invisible wall of fire that volumetric defense created. The success at Ossersleben accelerated implementation across all bomber groups. Ammunition loadouts were standardized to support the new doctrine, with each aircraft carrying 7,800 rounds, an increase of 1,120 rounds over previous configurations. Browning M2 machine guns received modified barrels with stellite linings that extended barrel life from 4,000 rounds to 7,500 rounds, allowing sustained fire without barrel changes during missions. Training evolved rapidly through early 1944. The initial 15 firing patterns were refined to 7 standardized defensive configurations, each optimized for specific threat approaches. Pattern Dog 4, which had proven so effective at Ossersleben, became the standard response to threats below the formation. It created a 3-dimensional cone of fire extending 300 yards below and behind the bomber stream with maximum density at 150 yards, precisely where German fighters typically initiated their pull-up maneuver after attacking from below. Technical improvements followed operational success. By March 1944, modified computing sites included pattern overlay indicators that helped gunners maintain proper aim points without visual reference. The Martin upper turret received an electromechanical timing system that automatically cycled between 3 predetermined positions, ensuring consistent coverage of threat sectors during pattern implementation. Most significantly, formation structures were redesigned to optimize volumetric coverage. The traditional 18-aircraft combat box was modified to a 21-aircraft configuration with additional spacing between elements. This new arrangement created overlapping fields of fire with no dead zones, essentially transforming each bomber group into a flying fortress in the literal sense, a mobile defensive position with interlocking fields of fire. Major James Robertson, operations officer for the 100th Bombardment Group, noted in his April 1944 assessment, "The psychological impact on our crews has been as significant as the tactical advantage. Gunners who previously felt helpless during adverse weather conditions now maintain aggressive defensive posture regardless of visibility. The knowledge that their fire is effective even without visual confirmation has transformed morale." German pilots reported growing frustration with the new American tactics. Oberleutnant Willi Unger of JG-3 wrote in his combat report after a failed intercept mission on April 6, 1944. "The Americans have developed a new defensive system. They fire continuously into empty space, creating zones through which attack is virtually impossible. 4 of our aircraft were hit before even reaching effective firing position. We must develop new tactics immediately." By mid-1944, volumetric firing patterns had been fully integrated with complementary defensive measures. When P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs reached the bomber formations, they coordinated with the defensive firing patterns, attacking German fighters that attempted to circumvent the walls of defensive fire. The once controversial tactic of firing blind had evolved into the cornerstone of bomber defense doctrine. The mathematics of probability had proven more effective than the art of marksmanship. Wilkins' theoretical models had become operational reality, and the skies above Germany were increasingly filled with burning wrecks of fighters that never reached their targets. The statistical impact of pattern defense protocols became apparent by mid-1944. Before their implementation, bomber losses had averaged 9.8% per mission. By June 1944, this figure had dropped to 3.2%, a 67% reduction in casualties. These statistics represented not just aircraft preserved, but human lives saved. Each bomber carried 10 crewmen, meaning that for every 100 bombers dispatched, 66 fewer airmen were lost under the new defensive doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay, analyzing these figures for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, calculated that pattern defense had saved approximately 3,140 airmen between January and June 1944. More significantly, the reduced loss rate meant bombing campaigns could be sustained indefinitely without depleting the available manpower pool. The strategic implications were profound. Beyond personnel preservation, pattern defense dramatically improved bombing effectiveness. With fewer disruptions from fighter attacks, bombardiers maintained more precise aim points. Analysis of bombing photographs showed a 41% increase in bombs falling within 1,000 feet of assigned targets compared to missions flown under conventional defensive protocols. The coordination between pattern defense and escort fighter operations created unexpected synergies. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8 Fighter Command, documented how P-51 Mustang pilots learned to anticipate the firing patterns and position themselves to intercept German fighters attempting to evade the defensive curtain. This cooperative approach produced a kill ratio of 13.1 during May 1944, with 8th Air Force fighters claiming 432 air-to-air victories against 33 losses. Lieutenant Richard Gordon, a P-51 pilot with the 352nd Fighter Group, described the tactical advantages. "We could see the wall of tracer fire 10 miles away. It was like watching artillery barrages in 3 dimensions. We'd position ourselves where enemy fighters would likely appear after breaking off their attack runs. They'd come streaming out of the bomber formation's defensive fire, damaged and disoriented, perfect targets for our guns." The German response to pattern defense evolved through increasingly desperate adaptations. Luftwaffe records captured after the war revealed that by March 1944, fighter pilots were being instructed to approach bomber formations from multiple angles simultaneously to dilute the effectiveness of pattern fire. This tactic proved suicidal against properly coordinated defences. Hauptmann Werner Mulders, inspector of fighter forces for the Luftwaffe, submitted a detailed analysis to Hermann Göring on April 12, 1944. American bombers have developed an impenetrable defensive system based on mathematical probability rather than visual acquisition. Their gunners fire into empty space along predicted intercept vectors with remarkable accuracy. Our pilots report entering solid walls of fire long before reaching effective attack range. German countermeasures included fitting Me-109s and FW-190s with additional frontal armour, but the weight penalties reduced performance and made them more vulnerable to American escort fighters. Some units attempted high-speed dives from 6,000 feet above the bomber stream, hoping to penetrate defensive fire through sheer velocity. This approach resulted in even higher losses, as aircraft experiencing compressibility effects became predictable targets. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned frontal assaults on bomber formations, switching to missile attacks using the Ruhrstahl X-4 wire-guided missile and unguided R-4M rockets fired from beyond defensive fire range. These weapons, while occasionally effective, lacked the accuracy to significantly impact the bombing campaign and diverted valuable resources from fighter production. German pilots increasingly viewed bomber interception as a suicide mission. Luftwaffe records documented morale problems across fighter units, with experienced pilots requesting transfers to the Eastern Front, where opposition was considered less lethal. Training programs struggled to replace losses, with new pilots receiving only 112 flight hours before combat deployment by late 1944, compared to 250 hours in 1942. Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, General of Fighters, summarized the situation in his August 1944 assessment to Hitler. American bomber formations now represent flying fortresses in the truest sense. Their defensive fire creates a three-dimensional barrier that our aircraft cannot penetrate without catastrophic losses. The mathematical precision of their defensive patterns negates our pilots' skill advantage. We must develop fundamentally new weapons systems or accept defeat in the air. The transformation of bomber defense through pattern firing represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the air war. What began as a controversial mathematical theory had become the foundation of bomber survivability. Gunners firing blind had reversed the mathematics of attrition and fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the skies over Europe. The evolution of pattern defense through late 1944 and into 1945 refined the mathematical principles that Lieutenant Colonel Wilkins had first proposed. By January 1945, the 8th Air Force had developed second-generation firing solutions based on extensive combat data. These updated protocols incorporated variables including formation altitude, ambient temperature, wind vectors, and even barometric pressure, factors that affected ballistic trajectories of .50 caliber rounds at extreme ranges. Pattern defense reached its apex during Operation Clarion in February 1945, when 1,437 bombers struck transportation targets across Germany. Despite the dispersed nature of the raids, which required smaller formations vulnerable to fighter attack, bomber losses remained below 1.8%. German records later confirmed that Luftwaffe commanders had specifically instructed their remaining fighter units to avoid engaging bomber formations, implementing pattern defense protocols. The final statistical analysis prepared for General Karl Spaatz in April 1945 documented the full impact of volumetric firing techniques. During operations from December 1943 through April 1945, formations employing pattern defense achieved a 4.7.1 favorable exchange ratio, meaning that for every bomber lost to enemy fighters, 4.7 German aircraft were destroyed by defensive fire. This compared dramatically with the 0.8.1 ratio experienced under conventional gunnery doctrines in early 1943, when more bombers were being lost than enemy fighters destroyed. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey calculated that pattern defense had directly contributed to the destruction of approximately 2,930 German fighters, while saving an estimated 1,563 bombers that would have been lost under previous defensive doctrines. Translated to human terms, this represented over 17,500 American airmen who returned home rather than becoming casualties or prisoners of war. The fundamental mathematical principles that made pattern defense effective were surprisingly straightforward when stripped to their essence. The technique worked because it exploited basic probability theory rather than attempting to solve the nearly impossible trigonometry problems of high-speed aerial gunnery. By creating a three-dimensional volume of fire with statistically optimal density, gunners transformed a precision targeting problem into a probability function. Technical Sergeant Warren Miller, who had participated in that first blind firing mission over Bremen in December 1943, provided perhaps the clearest explanation in his post-war memoir. "We stopped trying to hit specific fighters and started creating spaces where fighters couldn't survive. The math was simple. A German pilot had to fly through specific approach corridors to attack effectively. We filled those corridors with lead before he arrived. The result was inevitable." The technical innovations developed for pattern defense directly influenced post-war weapon systems. The defensive fire control computers installed on B-29 superfortresses incorporated algorithms derived from Wilkins' original mathematical models. These systems would evolve into the automated defensive arrays deployed on B-36 Peacemakers and B-47 Stratojets during the early Cold War period. Modern proximity-fused ammunition, computer-controlled defensive systems, and area denial weapons all trace conceptual lineage to the volumetric firing approach pioneered in 1943-44. The underlying principle, that probabilistic area coverage can be more effective than precision targeting when dealing with high-speed threats, remains fundamental to contemporary air defense doctrine. Perhaps most significantly, pattern defense represented a triumph of analytical thinking over conventional wisdom. When experienced gunners and traditionalists insisted, "You don't shoot what you can't see," mathematicians like Wilkins challenged this assumption with data and probability theory. The resulting innovations saved thousands of lives and helped secure air superiority over Europe. Colonel Curtis LeMay, reflecting on the development of pattern defense in a 1956 Air War College lecture, offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph. "The greatest innovations often come from challenging our most basic assumptions. We assumed effective gunnery required seeing the target. Mathematics proved otherwise. Volumetric fire based on probability theory allowed gunners to hit what they couldn't see, and the skies above Germany filled with wrecks of fighters that never reached their targets." The lesson extended far beyond specific aerial combat techniques. Pattern defense demonstrated that seemingly counterintuitive approaches could produce revolutionary results when backed by sound mathematical analysis. The gunners who opened fire blind and filled the sky with German wrecks had fundamentally transformed the nature of aerial warfare through the application of probability theory to combat operations, proving that sometimes the most effective solution is the one that initially appears to make the least sense.